I approach it from a historical perspective. We look at the ancestors, we look at the first draft, as it were, and we look at the diversity that comes off that, and then we can explore things like the ecology and the niches and the natural history, just how my mind works. So we start with each group, and we look at the founder. We want to look at the first vertebrate, or hypothesis what that first vertebrate was like. We want to take a step a little bit further deeper into the evolution, look at the first chordate, the first member of the phylum Chordata, and see what that creature looked like. And one thing that's occurred to me in recent years, why this, just because I think it's interesting, but why I think it's a useful exercise, is I think I mentioned this last week, the first vertebrate, that first creature that brought together the traits that we define as being a vertebrate is very different from us. I'll show you a picture of what we think it looked like in a little bit. But your body, 500 million years later, has aspects of that very first vertebrate. That little guy set the pattern, and we're still showing that. So the first chordate animal, the first member of our phylum, set some patterns that we're still using. Just like we step further up, the first mammal did things that we're still doing. So that's why I think it's useful to stop here. So anyway, early chordates and vertebrate origins. So phylum Chordata. Most chordates are vertebrates. But there's a couple small groups, and we'll look at these in the lab on Wednesday. There's a couple small groups of invertebrate, non-vertebrate chordates that we look at real quickly in this class because they help us set the pattern. Nothing cuter than bunnies and kittens. So there's our overall tree. We're done with most of this stuff now. These are all the invertebrate phyla. We're finished with them. We're now just focused on the phylum Chordata. Our phylum. Okay, zoom right in on them. Now, the phylum Chordata belongs to a small group of phylum. We touched upon this briefly last time. We belong to a small group of phylum called the Deuterostomia, or deuterostomes. Remember deuterostomes and protostomes, those two types of embryology? Okay. This is our group here. And we have two close relatives. They're worth having a quick look at. Let's zoom that out. Here we are. There's the phylum Chordata. And then these are deuterostomes, but they're not chordates. So these are guys we look to get an idea of what was happening down here and what was happening in the origin of our phylum. So these guys give us clues. Even if we don't have fossils, we frequently don't have fossils, we can look at these things to get some hints. So you recognize some of these, at least one of these things, right? Yeah, there we go. So these are the closest living relatives. And this is one that I think is kind of cool, so I always throw it in even though he's beginning to lose his position as a deuterostome. There's this group phylum called the Xenoturbellida. And there you go. There's a Xenoturbella. The genus is Xenoturbella. It's a little worm, a little flat-looking worm. He doesn't look anything like a chordate or anything like you would expect them to be a deuterostome. They're not even very big. But they're kind of fun. And the reason I think they're fun is scientists have looked at these for about 50 years and tried to figure out what the hell they are. If you look at the anatomy, it's very, very simple. But sometimes anatomy confuses us. So there was a lot of suggestion that these are deuterostomes. And you look at an evolutionary tree, here's the chordates, here's the deuterostomes here. So a long-term hypothesis is that they were a really close relative of us in deuterostomes. Although I've been reading recently, people looked at them more closely and now thinking, no, they really are really simple animals. They're really low-end bilateral animals, almost flatworms. So I just think kind of interesting that something can confuse us so thoroughly. So let's just let's move on from them. My batteries may be dying. There we go. So Xenoturbellida, we're done with them. These are things that are clearly deuterostomes, and they are close relatives to our phylum. One of them is the Hemichordata. And look at that word there, the phylum name. Hemichordata. They're called acorn worms. But Hemichordata, there's chordata, that's our phylum. And hemi, that means, kind of, not quite, half a chordate. And that name, I assume, was chosen because There are aspects of these creatures in their anatomy that suggest a close relationship to the chordates. They're called acorn worms. His mouth is right here. We'll look at their anatomy later, but he's normally this proboscis, this thing here. In most species, it's very small, and this looks like an acorn. Can you picture an acorn? Or it looks like a penis, but that's not as nice a word. The other phylum that's right up with us is the Echinodermata, the starfish crowd, sea urchins and starfishes. And that just doesn't make sense to a lot of people because that looks like a very simple animal. And yet it's towards the very top of the animal kingdom. This is really not working. We have to get the batteries. There we go. So anyway, by looking at these things, we can form hypotheses about what's happening down here. So there is an evolutionary tree. Here are and this is just deuterostomes. Here's the hemichordates. There's the echinoderms. And these are all chordates here. So this is what we're interested in. What was happening here? And these guys can give us clues. So there's the chordates, the phylum Chordata. That's one look at it. There's another. Here's an evolutionary tree with all sorts of groups you recognize up here. You recognize all these things. The fishes are a little less familiar to you so far. But there's an evolutionary tree, a cladogram. And as we walk through this, we're going to post characters on it. What do we call those characters? Like we had a character here that defines all of these guys. What do we call that?
Synapomorphy.
A synapomorphy. We're going to define the synapomorphies along the way here. So this is our guide. And this is from another textbook. It's pretty much the same thing. It's in a more traditional cladogram form. But there we go. These are the various groups of creatures we want to focus on. And again, where we are this morning is right here. We want to figure out what that little guy was. And you notice right here, there's the echinoderms. Remember when we were drawing the evolutionary tree? That would be our out group, right? There they are. Okay, phylum Chordata. So when we look at chordates, and I've said this a bunch of times because it's something that people forget. The phylum Chordata is not an equal sign to vertebrates. In blue here, these are the vertebrates. These are non-vertebrates. Most chordates are vertebrates, but there's a few non-vertebrate ones. So don't put an equal sign between chordate and vertebrate. Vertebrates are the major portion of the phylum Chordata. And again, there's an evolutionary tree, and there's some synapomorphies along the way there. And we'll touch upon these as we move on up this tree. And we've got all these cool Latin names in here. We're going to look at these different things in lab, at least some. Yeah, we're going to look at all these things in lab. We'll go back and forth between the English and the Latin, but make these your friends. Don't avoid them. And as I point out in a lot of my classes, as English speakers, there's a pretty heavy Latin vocabulary buried in English, and you have it. You just don't always know it. And if you're a Spanish speaker, even more so, because Latin and Spanish are both. Well, I think Latin is the origin of Spanish, or the precursor. Okay, let's look at these guys. The primitive chord. Yes.
So some chordates are not part of the vertebrae.
Exactly. These chordates are not vertebrates. Okay. So these are the primitive chordates. And when we look at them, they give us a clue as to what that early chordate looked like, what his niche was, what his biology was. And they in turn set the foundation right in here, which is blanked out, for the vertebrates, which we're going to define later. So there's the vertebrates. Let's just mark us with a tree. And the chordates, they're defined by these traits, which we'll go through in a little bit. Here's the vertebrates. And on this slide here, you've got the name along the side too. It's a pretty useful slide here. And there's traits, the synapomorphies for vertebrates. We're going to come back to those. Most of the vertebrates are fishes. And you can see right here a bunch of different types of fishes. And there's the English there for you. And we're going to walk through those a lot more quickly than we did last spring with ichthyology. We'll meet all these fishes. And fishes, I often think of fishes, they're the lower vertebrates. And they're the things between invertebrates and tetrapods. And Tetrapods means the four-footed vertebrates. I've defined them, right? Tetra means four, pod means foot, four-footed vertebrates. When we look at fishes, if we boil it down to just basics, there's three different types of fishes, three monophyletic groups we play with. And we'll walk through these as we go along. We have a crowd we call jawless fishes. They're the primitive ones. They tell us what an early vertebrate was like. We've got the shark crowd, which is next one up. And then we've got a group of fishes we call bony fishes. So jawless, shark crowd, bony fishes. And those are three monophyletic groups that we'll define as we move along. And then at the bottom, the end, they're the tetrapods. The tetrapods are the four-footed vertebrates. Right down here. Came off the fishes. And this is a really neat transition as we go from aquatic gill-breathing vertebrate to terrestrial walking around lung-breathing vertebrate. And we'll talk about that. So if we zoom just in on the tetrapods, these are things you know best, because you are a tetrapod, and these are the most familiar things. Very bottom end of the tetrapods are amphibians. Just think frog, salamander. A step up from the amphibians is a group that's called amniotes, amniota. That includes reptiles and mammals. We spend a lot of time on reptiles because that's a big group. Oh, they're there right there. There's reptiles, and then there's mammals. So that's the overview. And I went through that kind of quickly, and we'll hit all these things along the way, these synapomorphies as we go. But that's kind of so we're all on the same page here. Let's look at chordate origins. That's a fossil of a very early chordate, about 550 million years old. So, with regard to our evolutionary tree, what we're interested in is what was happening down here. Who was this? What was the first thing that was a chordate? That little guy established the pattern for the phylum Chordata. Who was he? So again, on this evolutionary tree, just a different one. This little guy right here. Oh, I just said this. This is important because this little guy sets the stage for all the rest of the phylum, all members of the phylum, and also most of that phylum is vertebrates, so them as well. Did that. So there's the closest relatives. Let's look to them. The hemichordates, they give us some clues. And the echinoderms give us some clues as to what that early chordate might have been. Now, these guys, hemichordates and echinoderms, the separation between the ancestor of the phylum Chordata and these guys is probably 550 million years ago. So these guys have been evolving on their own, separate lineage, 550, 60 million years. So they've had a long time to change, as have the chordates. We combine what we understand about the anatomy of living ones with what we interpret from fossil creatures. And we can generate hypotheses as to what was going on down there. And the fossil echinoderms have a lot to tell us, and the living hemichordate gives us clues as well. The two that we I don't think we have many fossil hemichordates. They don't leave good fossils. Now, fossil echinoderms are very different than the modern echinoderms. Their anatomy was different, their niche was different. And that's a fossil echinoderm. And the big thing about them is they were bilateral. Echinoderms are bilateral animals. Let's go back here for a sec. But when you look at the living ones, they don't look bilateral. Their body, more recently in evolution, has lost its bilateral symmetry and taken on kind of a superficial radial symmetry. That's not true radial symmetry. It's a bilateral animal pretending to be radial. But the ancestor, which we don't have anything like this anymore, these were little creepy crawly things, there we can tell. And they're about this big. And they creeped and crawled around in soft sediments. And That's reconstructions of what we think they might have looked like. So, we have a bilateral animal. Now just forget that starfish are round. We have a bilateral animal, and this little guy has a unique niche. This niche was bringing water in through its mouth and moving it through its pharynx and ejecting it through openings in the pharynx. Pumping water through the pharynx. Now that's very familiar to us because that's what fish do, to breathe. But these guys weren't breathing like that. They were feeding that way. They were pulling water through their mouth and filter feeding with these structures here. Filter feeding with their pharynx. This was a pharynx filter feeder. And that's a new niche. A little creepy crawly guy crawled through the muck, pulled that material into its mouth, filtered it over what we would call gill arches today, but they weren't breathing with them, so they're not gill arches. They're just arches in the pharynx, or openings. So we have pharynx filter feeding, and that was new. Now this is an acorn worm, a hemichordate, and we still see that niche in play today. When you look at this little guy, there's his mouth. These are the openings in his pharynx. We'll just call them gill pores. So again, gill makes you think they're breathing, right? They're not breathing with these. They're just feeding with them. Food particles that carried in with water get stuck on the inside, and they swallow them. It's filter feeding. Sponges filter feed, but this is a very different way of doing it. So, we have here, in these ancient echinoderms, and we still see it. And if you look at this guy here, his beautiful picture, there are his pharyngeal openings, his gill openings. Water's pulled in through the mouth, it's ejected here, food is retained. Actually, and this little guy breathes with all this material here. He's not breathing with his pharynx, he's just eating with it. This is a new niche and a new anatomy. And it must have been a really good way to go because it founded the phylum Chordata. This niche and anatomy was very important in the origin of the phylum Chordata, which is one of our more important phyla. If you want to talk about diversity and number of species, it's not just because we're in it, but it's a big, important phylum. And pharynx filter feeding is at the start of it. Okay? We're still in it. We're still not chordates yet. This is the earliest thing in the fossil record that's thought to be a chordate. A little guy about this big, called Paikia, I think I'm pronouncing that right, and he was a pharynx filter feeder about 500 million years ago. More than that, he was a free-swimming pharynx filter feeder. Say that fast 5 times. Free-swimming pharynx filter feeder. And so we have form and function here, niche and anatomy. We have the pharynx filter feeding. That may have evolved in echinoderms and hemichordates. But what these guys have done with it, they've added a new feature, this guy, and that's swimming around. He's not a creepy crawly in the mud filter feeder, he's a swimming filter feeder. And the niche free-swimming pharynx filter feeder, when we mesh that with the anatomy for free-swimming pharynx filter feeder, we get the first chordate. So there's the fossil, there's a reconstruction of this little creature. A little fish-like thing, not a fish yet, but a little fish-like thing. And we have a creature like this, very much like this alive today. That's a photograph, that's the drawing. We'll look at these in lab on Wednesday. And we'll define them later. But that's a free-swimming pharynx filter feeder. And he has what we think is very close to the original anatomy of the phylum Chordata. So, niche and anatomy get joined together here. We have a specific niche. We have a specific series of adaptations to make that niche work. And this is a hypothetical primitive chordate. This is what the first chordate might have looked like. And there are 4 traits here that have to do with that particular niche and anatomy. And if you have these 4 traits, you're a chordate. Let's look. 4 traits here. The first one is a notochord. A notochord is a stiff fibrous rod running the dorsal side of the animal's body. It's made of cartilage. It's stiff but flexible. And do you have a notochord? You're a chordate animal. Do you have a notochord?
Yes.
You did as an embryo. As an adult mammal, your notochord is completely replaced by your backbone, your vertebrae. But your ancestor had one. You had one as an embryo. So what this is this plays in, here it is in a really primitive fish. This is the foundation for the backbone, the vertebral column. And this is a structure that plays into that swimming niche. These are little chevrons here. These are muscles. They pull against that notochord, and we get that flapping motion like you think of when you think of a fish swimming. That was key there. Chordata means has a notochord. That's what the phylum name means. The next trait is a dorsal hollow nerve cord. Brain up here. This is the spinal cord. Do you have a dorsal hollow nerve cord as a chordate animal, as a mammal? Of course you do. Right? It's your spinal cord. And your brain. Did you know they're hollow? They're filled with fluid. Now, this is new. We haven't seen this anywhere else. And this is the foundation for a very complex, flexible nervous system that chordates and particularly vertebrates are going to play with. Natural selection is going to come with this and make you out of it. But that's the start. And if you look at invertebrates, the nerve cords are always ventral if they're present, like in a grasshopper or an earthworm, and they're never hollow. This is unique. The next thing, we're going to call them pharyngeal slits or clefts, or sometimes they're called gill pouches or gill pores or gill slits. Got all those names for them. And that's the perforations in the pharynx. These already evolved. These show up in the ancestor, the phylum Chordata, but we put them here because they're so important to us. They start off again as for feeding. But vertebrates take these and repurpose them, and probably much more familiar to in the pharynx of a fish, which they become breathing structures. Start off as a feeding structure, get repurposed into a very efficient respiration structure. Finally, this one seems kind of anticlimactic, kind of boring. A tail. Specifically a tail that extends beyond the anus. There's the anus, there's the tail. And you think, big deal. Well, it kind of is a big deal because only chordates have tails. If you look at pick up a grasshopper and look for his rear end, his anus is right at the end of his body. Earthworm, right at the end of the body. Only chordates have tails. And that plays into that swimming niche. So when we look at these four things together, oh, there's about swimming. Do you have a tail as a higher primate mammal?
You have a tailbone.
You have a tailbone. You had a tail as an embryo. As higher primates, we lost our tail. But again, in evolution, your ancestor has to have it. You can lose it and still be part of the group. So if we look at these traits together, they bring together in one animal these features. Gill arches, which start off as a feeding structure, but later get repurposed into a very efficient breathing structure. The notochord is the proto-backbone. It starts off as a flexible thing for muscles to pull so you can swim. Later becomes, well, the foundation of the vertebrate body. And that dorsal hollow nerve cord must have been really cool because it's the foundation of the most complex nervous systems we have, the vertebrate nervous system. So this protochordate animal sets the stage. Where am I here? Right here. I'm getting ahead of myself. There we go. Okay. Let's look at a group of animals we call protochordates. We'll get these out in lab on Wednesday. Protochordates. It's not a taxonomic category, it's just a name. And it means primitive chordates. So they're chordates, they're not vertebrates. These guys give us a peek, let us explore what the early chordate might have looked like, and they also let us explore that transition from invertebrate to vertebrate. So here they are on our evolutionary tree. They're way down here. And they're not vertebrates, so we don't spend a whole lot of time with them, just a few minutes today and a little bit on lab on Wednesday. Here they are on this evolutionary tree. Got these two evolutionary trees. You can go back and forth between it, whichever one works for you. Okay, so darn it, I gotta get new batteries. Two groups here. These are both subphylum. That's the rank that's usually given these. Subphylum Urochordata. These don't look like chordates at all. They're little globby things. They're called sea squirts or tunicates. Urochordata, by the way, means chordate with a tail. Uro means tail. These are all marine, and when you look at an adult animal, it doesn't look like a chordate. It's got a perforated pharynx for feeding, but there's no tail, there's no notochord, there's no central nervous system in the adult. And when we're out on field trips, we sometimes find these in the intertidal zone, not very often anymore. I'm sure 50 years ago they were more common. The one we found out in Santa Rosa last fall, as big as my thumb, coolest little creature. Tide went out and he was just hanging off the underside of a rock. They're called sea squirts because if you poke one, they compress muscles and they're filled with water and they'll spray water out at you. Now, he's a little pharynx filter feeder, but he's not free swimming as an adult. The larvae are, though. The larvae are short-lived and very, very small, and they look like tiny tadpoles. And you can see, there's the pharynx, and there's the gill slits, and there's the tail and the notochord. These little guys swim around the plankton, and they have all the traits. And then, eventually, they glue their face down on a rock, lose the tail, lose the nervous system, lose the notochord, and just become this thing here. Specialized anatomy, specialized niche. Oh, there's the transition. I thought I had the slide here. There's the larva, and then it glues its face to an appropriate surface, loses its mobility, loses its ability to think, and just becomes a blob. But they're kind of cool. The other protochordate group are called cephalochordates, and that means chordate with a head, cephalochordate. And they often go by the name lancet or Amphioxus. That's an old genus name. It looks like a genus name, doesn't it? It's the old one, so we still use the common name. Get an idea of how big they are by that picture there. They're small little fish-like things. I was going to say something about them, popped up in my brain. Okay. There's the cartoon of one. Well, we got an idea how big they are. The adults are about this big. We'll get these out in lab on Wednesday. And when we look at this guy, we see the four chordate traits perfectly presented in a little animal that's a free-swimming pharynx filter feeder. This little guy's got the niche. He's got the anatomy that we think the original chordate was using. It's an almost direct connection back to that ancient history. Still not a vertebrate, though. So, there's our closest relatives. This guy here went bilateral, or went back to bilateral, I should say. Free-swimming pharynx filter feeder. And there's, no, they're there, lancets and tunicates, or sea squirts. Okay? And our next transition is right here. We're going to take something in this group here and move on to vertebrates. So we look at our evolutionary tree again. These are the traits that define the vertebrates. All four of these traits together. And there's a fifth one they sometimes have called endostyle. Don't worry about that. Can't remember if it's in the lab manual or not. We'll look at it if it's in the lab. But bringing all these four traits together, or five, in one animal, that's what happened here. And the one key defining trait, if there is one, would be notochord. Nobody had that before. Okay? So, there you go. a real good peek in what we think that early chordate might have looked like, and actually a pretty good peek at what we think the thing that transitioned to a vertebrate looked like. So vertebrates are the next step. And we're done with these guys. We'll look at them in the lab, but we're done with these guys. Everybody on up is a vertebrate. And so we wanted to find the vertebrata, the subphylum vertebrata. We're good so far? So here's an invertebrate, cephalochordata. We just looked at him, lancelet. And this is a really primitive vertebrate. It's the larva of a fish called a lamprey. We'll look at them in lab as well. And you can see a lot of similarity there. The anatomy is very similar. Actually, the niche is very similar. It's just this guy has the vertebrate traits. He's taken this basic niche and anatomy and layered on what it is to be a vertebrate. So, we're going to go through some of these things as we go along, but I found this cool thing online. There's the ancestor, the invertebrate. There's a primitive vertebrate. And a bunch of these things that are labeled here are unique vertebrate things that we don't see up here, or the unique vertebrate ways of doing things. Subphylum vertebrata. Usually given the rank subphylum, and I think we'll go with that. As I said last time, the ranks, don't worry about ranks unless I give you explicitly. The ranks of different groups tend to move up or down. Sometimes some people consider a particular thing a class. Some people say, oh no, it's not a class, it's a subclass or a superclass. Not important. Unless I put it up there, then it's important. So here's the vertebrates, things you recognize. And there they are on that spread out evolutionary tree from primitive to more advanced as we move on up. So, sometimes there's a whole day between what I just did and what I do now. That's why sometimes these slides repeat. I'm just reviewing. But we just did this. There's the defining chordate traits. Let's get rid of all the invertebrates here. And let's just go to vertebrates. And there's all the vertebrates there. Nothing confusing us on the far side there. That's the animal that laid down the basic vertebrate pattern. And you still have aspects of that in your construction today. So we want to see what that thing might have been. Vertebrate origins. That's a fossil of what's thought to be a very early vertebrate. Did that. Now I think I touched upon this earlier, and a different edition of your textbooks treat this slightly differently. I don't want to spend 2 days to go through this particular convoluted bit of thinking, other than to say vertebrata, that's the group we're talking about. Craniata, in the way I'm presenting it, is just a straight equal sign from one to the other. Craniates and vertebrates are the same thing, the way I'm presenting them. The way I think the current edition of your textbook presents it is just slightly differently. The way your textbook presents is it takes vertebrates are basically all the craniates minus one very primitive group. So one way of thinking, the craniates is a big expansive group, and vertebrates is nearly all the craniates. We just take out one really primitive group. It's a craniate, but not a vertebrate. Okay, I don't want to go through that. It would take another half hour, and I don't want to spend it on that. But put an equal sign between those. And there's that slide again. There's the invertebrate. There's the vertebrate. One hypothesis of vertebrate origin is we go from something like this to this new way of being. And actually, the current hypothesis, remember that larva from the sea squirt, the little thing that looked like a tadpole? Sea squirts are more closely related to vertebrates than this thing is. And it may be this larva, this little tadpole-like larva, that's the origin of the vertebrates. And look at this word here, pedimorphosis. You go to a pediatrician, what is he or she looking at?
Children.
Children, yeah. That means children, or juvenile. Pedimorphosis is a type of evolution where you have a juvenile form achieving sexual maturity and founding a new group. So you got a juvenile something, and instead of going through its normal development and becoming the adult form, it stops its development and gets functional sex organs and goes another route. It's called pedimorphosis. And one hypothesis is that vertebrates come from these little larvae, and at some ancient time, in one lineage, these larvae, there was a population, and the larvae didn't go on to their adult form, a sea squirt. They had a mutation or a bunch of genetic variation came together, and these guys got sexually mature and went to form a new thing. That new thing was vertebrates. So we've got the traits. We've got the notochord, the nerve tube, the gill bars, and that may be the foundation. Although I think this slide is much cleaner because this thing actually looks a lot like a primitive vertebrate. This is Amphioxus. It looks a lot like that, but we think this is the origin. I don't think it's real important for our discussion here, but it's a good chance to talk about pedimorphosis, which is an evolutionary phenomenon, again, where the juvenile members of some population start reproducing sexually, and they lead to a whole new type of creature. Humans, just to put another context, humans are thought to be pedimorphic apes. Adult human anatomy looks a lot similar to a fetal chimp than it does to an adult chimp. So that's one hypothesis there. I'm not up on that. You can take that in anthropology class. So, there's our little tadpole larva of sea squirt, and it just starts reproducing on its own and starts a whole new kind of animal. Never goes into this metamorphic mode here. And that thing may have been the early vertebrate, a little pharynx filter feeding free swimmer. However it happened, let's define the vertebrates. Let's look for some synapomorphies, right? So there you go, I made a list. These are a bunch that are frequently forwarded. Don't try to write those down. We'll go through them one by one. These are the ones I want us to play with. These are the synapomorphies. And in this ancestral lineage, these traits were laid down, and we see them throughout the modern vertebrates. So, innovations are synapomorphies. The first one, and one of the most obvious ones, is a cranium. And that's why sometimes the vertebrates are called craniates, because of a cranium. The cranium, this is a very primitive fish. It's a lamprey again. And what the cranium is, right here, it's a box in which we put the central nervous system, the brain. Made of cartilage or bone, it supports the central nervous system. We haven't had that before. That's new. So cranium, I think this thing calls it a distinct head. Cranium, I think, is a better term. Grasshoppers have a distinct head. There's a more complex brain that all vertebrates share. So we assume the ancestor developed this, and it's called a tripartite brain. That means 3 parts, and forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. That's a vertebrate thing, that 3-part brain. Vertebrates have complex cranial sense organs. Now, invertebrates have some of these senses, but in vertebrates or craniates, these sense organs are concentrated in the cranium. And the 3 senses that we focus on are olfaction, the sense of smell, vision, and hearing. And in the cranium and the central nervous system in the brain of a vertebrate, we have the olfactory center, we have the vision center, we have the very well-defined hearing center, otic center. So the cranium develops and it becomes the home for these complex sense organs. The ancestral vertebrate invented an inner ear with semicircular canals. At least one. You have to have at least one semicircular canal. Here's the brain. This stuff here is the inner ear. And There's those semicircular canals. There's fluid, and we touched upon this when we talked about senses. So that gives vertebrates not only an acute sense of hearing, but a really good sense of balance. And if you're a free-swimming creature, you're moving through the water, that was a pretty good innovation. That's why I put a question mark on it, because there's some debate, and I'm not up on it, so that this is an embryological thing. They're called neural crest cells. That's a type of stem cell, if you want to think of it that way. And this is the back of an embryo as it's developing, like a frog embryo or any actually vertebrate embryo. And the neural crest is a ridge, a crest that forms along the length of the back. And that's going to be the hollow nerve tube right there. And as the nerve tube forms, special cells near it are called neural crest cells. And they will then migrate throughout the body and are stem cells. They are the first cells in certain features that only vertebrates have. So it's a new kind of stem cell. Just for completeness, it looks like the neural crest. Look where the neural crest appears to evolve. This is one of the traits that, see, there's the sea squirts. That puts sea squirts really closely related to vertebrates, more close related than the creature that actually looks like that protovertebrate. But these guys have a neural crest. So that's a trait that may have evolved a little bit earlier. Again, in that same spot, this is a back of an embryo. There's the forming neural tube. We're only getting half of it there. And there's neural crest. And then on the surface there's a little group of stem cells called the placode. And if you take development, maybe they'll talk about that in development, but the ectodermal placodes, it's another set of stem cells that we only see in vertebrates. And so I'm just really putting in here for completeness more than anything else. Remember, stem cells are cells in the embryo that kind of they're open to forming lots of different things. And this is a unique type of stem cell that only vertebrates have, and they will then migrate throughout the embryo into certain positions and develop into things that only vertebrates have. And off the top of my head, I don't know what they become. And we have a fancy new kidney. We're not going to talk a lot about this, but we have a kidney, a urine-forming kidney called a glomerular kidney, and that shows up in the ancestor of the vertebrates. In a glomerular kidney, a little cartoon here of it, you've got, this is a blood vessel, a little capillary associated with blood vessel, so blood flows through here. And this is a collecting tubule, and so materials are pushed out of the blood in this collecting tubule, and that's urine. It's eliminated from the body, and that's a vertebrate innovation. And I left the most obvious one for last, but there you go, it is vertebrae. We take that notochord that chordates invented, and we replace the notochord with a backbone, a vertebral column. And that can be made of bone, or it can be made of cartilage, like in it. So, there's the traits, and again, they define the vertebrates. Question?
With the senses, did the cranial nerves come with that?
Off the top of my head, question about cranial nerves. Off the top of my head, I don't know. That's a question we'd have to ask an anatomist. But yeah, I assume by this point in time we have the 12 cranial nerves. I can't remember. Cranial nerves, ocular, otic, ocular motor. Yeah. I assume they're playing on. But I think some of the primitive vertebrates only have between 10 cranial nerves. Anyone taken anatomy recently? Yeah. That sound familiar? You don't remember.
It's been a long time.
Yeah. So anyway, who was this thing? We don't have anything alive at this level of evolution today. So we have to look to the fossils. We can look to primitive fishes to get some ideas, but we don't have that guy anymore, so we have to look to fossils. And we have some candidates that only recently discovered, by the way. There's some really puzzling creatures about 525 million years old. That's a long time ago. And those are reconstructions of them from the Cambrian period. And they're about this big, Actually, they're pretty common, and someone found a mass mortality and nice specimens to study. And they are hypothesized to be chordates, certainly, vertebrates probably. And these are two candidates here, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce this word. They're from China. All sorts of cool stuff's coming out of China right now in terms of fossils. Again, the little dagger means only from the fossil record. And these little creatures, some people think they're just two names for the same thing. Other people say they're two separate things. These are candidates for the earliest vertebrate. And I need to learn how to pronounce that, but I can't. There it is. It's a little free-swimming pharynx filter feeder. And one of the things that pushes the concept that it's a vertebrate is they have cranial sense organs. There are evidence of eyes on these things. There is a fossil. That's what we're looking at. There's the reconstruction. There's the fossil there. And focusing very nicely on the eye there. And some features that suggest the vertebrae are being replaced by little cartilage, or the notochord is being replaced by little cartilaginous vertebrae. And yeah, anyway, there's just the fossils. When you're working with a half billion year old fossil, you take what you get and try to interpret it. So, early vertebrates, current hypothesis. Yes, somebody made a stuffed one, which I think is adorable, and selling it on eBay. The most primitive fish we have still with us today, the most primitive vertebrate we have, creatures called hagfishes. We'll get them out in lab and we'll talk about them later today. They're not at all like this thing here. So there's an awful lot of evolution between this and the most primitive thing we can look at as something that's still with us today.
Bless you.
Thank you. So summing up. Bring together these two things in your mind and do it again when we get to the earliest reptile and the earliest bird and the earliest mammal. Niche and anatomy. That first adopter of that new niche became the first chordate. Later, something became the first vertebrate. And so we look at the anatomy, form hypotheses about the niche. And at the beginning of each of these groups, there's usually something unique. Somebody who came up with a unique combination of adaptations. And it turned out to work really well. And these groups took off. So, invertebrate, vertebrate. Has the chordate traits. This guy has the chordate traits, but also has the vertebrate traits layered on top of that. Okay. So, free-swing pharynx filter feeder was the ancestor. The early vertebrate, almost certainly a free-swing pharynx filter feeder. But with these cool new vertebrate traits, probably doing it better and setting the stage for a more complex way to interact with the environment. Fancier free-swing pharynx filter feeder, say that 5 times fast. So, niche and anatomy. Let's go back 500 million years. I love these paintings. They may be completely wrong, but I think they're cool and very imaginative. Look at that stuff. Something like this, the foundation for everything that comes later. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
So how recently did China release these fossils?